Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to the Society, to May, to Laura, to everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you today to talk a bit about this new research that I'm undertaking at the moment on the trigger, what actually triggers this process of decolonization. Okay, so I don't have long and I have a lot to say, so let's get started. Okay, so these are the three figures that I kind of want to focus on today. On the far left, you have Lacan, in the middle, you have François Cruz, and then obviously there's Frantz Fanon. And what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and connect these three authors and to try and talk about an aspect of, I suppose, Fanon's, the psychical mood of what precedes the moment of decolonization. So I don't want to talk necessarily about decolonization. I want to talk about what precedes decolonization and how that we actually get there for Fanon. And so in order to do this, I'm going to kind of track through these three books. The really, really early Lacan, his doctoral dissertation from 1932, and then there's this book that has gone totally ignored and under-recognized, Le vécu de la fin du monde dans la folie, which is the 1948 thesis by, thank you so much, that's really great, thank you. The 1948 thesis of François Cruz, and then obviously Fanon and how Fanon interprets this aspect from Lacan that goes through Cruz that becomes so central, in my view, of this process of triggering disenclosure of decolonization. Okay, so the book that I'll talk a lot more about in this presentation, Le vécu de la fin du monde dans la folie, is actually about this notion of le vécu, the erlebnis, right? The lived experience, which is a phenomenological term. And it's also something that Fanon talks about in Black Skin, White Masks, in this extremely famous chapter, L'expérience vécue du noir. And actually, I think that we can reread this chapter in light of this 1948 thesis by François Cruz, that I think there's lots of evidence that actually Fanon had read and I suppose internalized some of the lessons from Cruz's thesis. So without further ado, I just want to highlight this idea of the end of the world that comes again and again throughout Fanon's writing. So whether it's Pour la Masque Blanc, whether it's L'enceinte de la Révolution Algérienne, or whether it's Les Damnés de la Terre, Fanon again and again mentions this notion of the end of the world, la fin du monde. So here, channeling in Les Césaires, as I'm sure we all know, in Pour la Masque Blanc, he says, la seule chose au monde qui vaille la peine de commencer, la fin du monde, parbleu. And this is one of two moments in this book where Fanon mentions the end of the world, so once channeling in Les Césaires and once not. So this, I suppose, quotation got me thinking about this notion of the end of the world and how it's relevant to Fanon. So this is the second moment that it comes up. In L'enceinte de la Révolution Algérienne, in a moment I'm sure we will all remember, where he's talking about the 7-year-old boy who's forced to watch his parents be tortured, he also evokes this notion of la fin du monde. And actually the English translation is wrong on this. So there's this idea of the atmosphere. So he says, cet enfant fut porté par son grand-père pendant 5 jours et 5 nuits avant d'atteindre le camp. L'enfant dit, je ne désire qu'une chose, pouvoir découper un soldat français en petits morceaux, de tout petits morceaux. And then Fanon says, eh bien, cet enfant de 7 ans, croit-on donc qu'il soit facile de lui faire oublier à la fois le meurtre de ses parents et sa vengeance énorme, cette enfance orpheline qui grandit dans une atmosphère de fin du monde, est-ce là tout le message que laissera la démocratie française? Obviously this ironic ending, but grounding it in this idea of the end of the world. But what is this idea of the end of the world? Why does it keep coming up? In The Wretched of the Earth, in Les Damnés de la Terre, he says, les colonisés sont persuadés que leur destin se joue maintenant. Ils vivent dans une atmosphère de fin du monde et ils estiment que rien ne doit leur échapper. So this idea of the end of the world comes up again and again, is occulted almost in the English translations, and the actual words fin du monde, end of the world, are not used, and often it's translated in another way. But underlying all these different texts is a kind of desire that is clear from Fanon for a kind of end of a world. I suppose my research attempts to understand and unpack this notion. So, back to these three figures, at least the early figures. So Lacan on the one hand and François Trustillès on the other. There's a kind of connection between these two theorists. We know, and a lot of work has gone into showing how, I suppose on some level, Fanon was quite close to Trustillès. They worked together at Saint-Alban, and I'll say more about that later on. But the kind of relationship that Fanon has to Lacan, for example, is less, I suppose, well developed or established, given the two figures never actually met, and apart from some various different footnotes and so on, and engagements in Fanon's work of Lacan, there was no kind of clear connection, at least no biographical connection, I suppose. So, the first part of this presentation, we'll just try and talk about the importance then of this early Lacan, the kind of psychiatric Lacan from 1932, and why that's relevant for Trustillès. So I just want to say a couple of things before we start talking about this idea of les moments féconds, which Lacan develops in his doctoral thesis. Lacan at this time in 1932 is a renegade, hated by the psychiatric establishment. In fact, during his doctoral viva, one of his supervisors said and wrote down, "Ce garçon nous ennuie." So Lacan in 1932 is someone who is looking for a fight with the kind of psychiatric establishment and is very unhappy with the kind of dominant strain of psychiatry that is very much based on a kind of organic understanding of the causality of mental disease. So Lacan does not want to see the development of mental disease as being in some sense biologically grounded, but rather wants to understand mental disease as being something linked to the social. And we can already begin to see why this would be appealing, both to François Trustillès, but also for our purposes here, for Fanon. Lacan develops a notion against the kind of organic, approach of understanding mental disease, so the organodynamic, aspect. He developed this notion of psychogenesis, which is very strongly linked to the development that Fanon will make in Masque Blanc, this notion of sociogenesis. So if we track this idea, actually sociogenesis emerges from the really fertile, work of the early Lacan from 1932. So what's this notion of the fertile moment? And why does Fanon mention it in his doctoral dissertation, but also in Masque Blanc? Now, in order to understand this notion of le moment fécond de la psychose, the fertile moments of psychosis, and how that's linked to Fanon, I first want to kind of link it to something that might be more familiar. So there's a notion in kind of contemporary psychoanalysis called the elementary phenomena of a psychosis, of the development of a psychosis. But don't forget, we're still trying to think about what's the trigger, right? That's the ultimate question. That's the thesis. That's what I'm trying to understand. What's the status of the end of the world, and how is decolonization triggered? Okay, so we're trying to build a kind of psychological argument through Fanon of how of Lacan, how Fanon gets there. So this idea of an elementary phenomena is linked then to Lacan's notion of the fertile moment. And an elementary phenomena is a moment where you first have a thought that is a psychotic thought, okay? So you might be standing, you might have a patient who would say to you, well, I was standing at a tube platform and a voice from nowhere said, jump. And that's the elementary phenomena, right? That's the moment that this idea comes to. Now, the psychiatrists and the psychoanalysts, they want to divorce this idea of the elementary phenomena to the secondary phenomena, which is a couple of weeks later, you might be thinking, oh, well, where did that idea come to me from? And then you might have a paranoid idea, such as, well, there's all these listening devices in everyone's pockets, right? Mobile phones and so on, that are speaking, right? That are giving me thoughts, that these thoughts are coming to me from somewhere. Now that, again, is another delusional thought, right? It's a psychotic thought. But it is an attempt at a cure, right? It is an attempt to rationalize the elementary phenomenon. Okay, so for Lacan, this idea of the fertile moments of the delirium are linked to this idea of elementary phenomena. And he says, in écrit, he says, je m'apercevais dans l'observation même de ma malade qu'il est impossible de situer exactement par l'amnèse la date et le lieu géographique de certaines intuitions, d'illusions de la mémoire, de ressentiments convictionnels, d'objectivation imaginaire, qui ne pouvaient être rapportés qu'au moment fécond du délire pris dans son ensemble. So the idea is that you have these elementary phenomena. You have this moment that something comes to you, right? It comes to your esprit, I suppose. It just comes into your head. And actually, they're very subtle. They're not always as obvious as jump in front of a train. But there's a moment where you begin to think, okay, well, something's up. Something's up. And for Lacan, this is a psychotic beginning. It is a trigger of a psychosis. And we need to take it in as an ensemble, right, as a whole. And we need to understand this psychic mood, I suppose, as a whole. Okay, so that's what Lacan means by les moments féconds. Now, let's look at this quote from Paul Masque Blanc. This is a wonderful moment where Fanon was talking, I think, kind of developing an argument for black psychosis, and he says, on nous objectera qu'il n'y a rien de psychotique chez les Noirs, dont il est question ici. And he says, toutefois, il y a quelques années, nous avons connu un Noir étudiant en médecine, surely he means himself here, il avait l'impression infernale que jamais il n'arriverait à se faire reconnaître en tant que confrère par les Blancs, en tant que docteur par les malades européennes. À ces moments d'intuition délirante, les moments féconds, and here there's a footnote, this idea of les moments féconds in Lacan, de la psychose, il s'enivrait. Il voulait avoir sous ses ordres des Blancs, c'était un chef comme tel, il devait être craint ou respecté. C'est en fait ce qu'il voulait, ce qu'il recherchait, amener les Blancs à avoir avec lui une attitude de noir. Ainsi se vengeait-il de l'imago, il avait fait de tout temps obsédé l'homme noir, effrayé, tremblant, humilié devant le Seigneur blanc. And so the idea is, and what's the status of this usage? Why does Fanon invoke Lacan at this moment when he's trying to develop this argument about what black psychosis might look like? And how is it linked and why is it important for the rest of this book and the rest of this work? So that's the kind of question that's motivating me at this point. So, he again and again, Fanon wants to talk about this idea of black psychosis in Benoît Mestre Blanc as a kind of delirious constellation, right? The kind of the mental, psychological, psychopathological atmosphere is one of delirium. So he says, and here's another quote from Benoît Mestre Blanc, he says, chaque fois qu'un homme de couleur proteste, il y a aliénation. Chaque fois qu'un homme de couleur éprouve, il y a aliénation. Souvent, l'attitude du noir en face du blanc ou en face de son congénère reproduit presque intégralement une constellation délirante qui touche au domaine pathologique. So the idea is that in the contact with the white world, like in this process of having been colonized, you immediately are forced into alienation. This alienation is psychotic in character. And that's the kind of idea. It's being un enfant noir, he says, ayant grandi au sein d'une famille normale, s'anormalisera au moindre contact avec le blanc, avec le monde blanc. So it's this idea ultimately that the social world in the way that it is constituted and figured has an impact on your psyche. And this psyche then needs to come to a realization. It needs to come to the disalienable realization. And that process goes through psychosis for Fanon. That's the argument, I believe, that he's making. Now, it's important before we get on to talk about Frantz Fanon and to try and connect this idea then of black psychosis to this idea of the end of the world and madness. I just want to highlight why did we begin by talking about Lacan? Well, what's interesting is that Frantz Fanon, when he begins to think about what this idea of le vécu de la fin du monde dans la folie looks like, he grounds it in Lacan's notion of les moments féconds de la psychose. It's idea of what I called earlier elementary phenomena. So this is Jean Houry, who is also one of the founders of the institutional psychotherapy movement, and this is a great quote which I think kind of connects some of these themes from the early Lacan through François Tostiès and then to Fanon to hopefully make the argument that I'm trying to make about the notion of black psychosis. So he says here, pour le dire autrement, and this is Houry speaking, in the preface to François Tostiès' doctoral thesis, the 1948 book, he says, pour le dire autrement, on peut dire qu'il y a à un moment donné une sorte de bifurcation de l'existence. Il y a, comme disait Lacan, un moment fécond. Or, cette cassure est plus ou moins patente, visible. Elle correspond à ce que Tostiès appelle la catastrophe existentielle. Il a mis en valeur le fait de cette catastrophe qui est souvent vécue comme une fin du monde, soit comme un écroulement soudain en quelques secondes, soit comme quelque chose de très progressif, une sorte d'implosion qui peut durer des mois et des mois. Mais le parti pris par Tostiès, en quoi on peut dire que sa thèse est un manifeste, est de souligner que cette catastrophe, quelle que soit sa temporalité, est toujours suivie par un temps de reconstruction de la personnalité, comme après le déluge, après la catastrophe, on trie les matériaux pour reconstruire. And so this idea becomes really important for Fanon. It's not just chaos. It's not just black psychosis. It's not just ending the world, trying to end the world. It is also ground clearing for reconstruction. And Tostiès is very clear when he talks about this, as we will see, that the reconstruction is very important. Okay, so then what is this notion then of the Erlebnis, of the end of the world? What is Tostiès trying to do? Now, a few things to say here about Tostiès. François Tostiès was a fully trained psychiatrist at the University of Barcelona, and during the Spanish Civil War was forced to flee into France. I'm sure this is all history that everyone knows very well. And I'm sure people know this, but when he fled, he ended up in a work camp. The French had work camps for these refugees. When he fled, he had a copy of Lacan's doctoral dissertation under his arm, according to him. And when he arrived at Saint-Alban, he actually decided with the patients to make homespun copies of Lacan's doctoral dissertation, and they used to sell them at the local market. So for Tostiès, this thesis, right, this Lacan's thesis, this renegade psychiatrist's thesis, is very important. Anyway, so he finally, in the camp, he tried to set up a kind of psychiatric ward amongst all the refugees. Eventually, people realized that he's qualified, and because in France, you have to be retrained for everything, because French people don't recognize anyone else's degrees, do they? François Tostiès had to undertake a second doctoral dissertation, and this is the one that I'm talking about. Okay. Le vécu de l'expérience, le vécu dans le monde de la folie. Non, dans le vécu de la fin du monde dans la folie. And so he ends up eventually at a place called Saint-Alban, and it is here that he will stay for the majority of his life and work in what him and Houry and others, Lucien and so on, will call institutional psychotherapy. And institutional psychotherapy is an attempt to do psychiatry in a totally different way. And this is a kind of total side note, but the kind of institution that Lacan created was another institution called, Saint-Alban created was another institution called Laborde, where Félix Guattari worked for the majority of his career, and so did Jean Houry, and that only shut last week. So we're living right now the end of this kind of experiment. Anyway, so Tostiès is at Saint-Alban, and what they try to do is they say that the problem with mental disease, I suppose, trying to cure it within the hospital environment actually does more harm than good. Actually, the fantasy of you living within a kind of certain institutional space doesn't give you the time or space to actually develop, right? And so they begin to so Tostiès' big idea, that is this idea that actually born in Lacan, that comes out through institutional psychotherapy, is this idea that the social world is the problem. And actually, the social needs to change. before you can get better, right? Before your mental distress can be alleviated. And so they begin to rethink the institution, and they say rather than bend the patient to the realities of the institution, we should bend the institution to the realities of the patient. And so the kind of things that they would do is that they would dismantle all hierarchy. So everyone would clean. You know, the psychiatrists would clean, the chefs would clean, the patients would clean, everyone would cook. Everyone would take time to the running and the living of this institution. And so Saint-Alban is a kind of really, I suppose, experimental place where some of these ideas are taking root and hold. And Fanon arrives and lives here for, as we was. Henry Rhodes says, I think it's 18 months. Toussiès believed it was 3 years, but either way, Fanon was here for a long time. This then is the space of institutional psychotherapy that Fanon understands. So we just want to then talk a bit about this idea of the end of the world that then Toussiès develops whilst he's at this institution. And so he's writing this doctoral dissertation. And Toussiès wants to see a new form of, I guess, a kind of notographic case study. He wants to think of a form of psychosis that is not like a typical one, but the way that he sees it is the possibility of an opening, the possibility of an opening. And so he wants to understand in this book, a kind of, through Gérard de Nerval, which is a kind of case study that he uses, he wants to understand how certain patients, after having had this moment fécond, begin then to desire the end of the world and the attempt at a reconstruction. Okay? So what we're going to do now, we're just going to try and develop and track this argument from Le Vécu de la fin du monde dans la folie. So he says, le paranoïaque rebâtit the paranoid rebuilds the universe by means of this delusional work. What we take for the morbid production, the formation of the delusion, is in reality the attempt at healing the reconstruction. So you might begin having these psychotic thoughts, right? Your delusion might enter in such a way, but it's actually an attempt at you trying to figure out how you're supposed to get out of this situation. Okay, so it's an attempt at healing yourself. And this idea comes from Freud, ultimately. La dissolution qui menace la personnalité et ses activités se voit contrecarrée par l'impulsion à atteindre une forme de vie cohérente, une nouvelle forme de vie rationnelle. So the process of desiring the end of the world, the psychotic delusions, is actually you trying to be more rational. You're trying to think, you accept that the social world is wrong, something is wrong. You know it in your heart that things can no longer go on as they are. You want the end of the world, the end of this world, because what you're really looking for is a new form of rational life. You're trying to overcome. Cette nouvelle vie anormale et caricaturale a cependant avec le normal en fait commun fondamental, celui de mettre de l'ordre dans le monde et d'assurer à la personnalité une unité par centralisation magique. So the idea is that you're looking for that attempt to create a kind of rationality that is in step with what we would perceive as a kind of normal psychic existence. And it's at this point that Toussiès develops at the kind of peak of his argument about this idea of desiring the end of the world, what that might look like, and this kind of very heavy theoretical construction is a kind of attempt to see in madness the human body. Okay? So he says, notre corps et la société nous facilite la tâche, right? Us normal people, we find life and living to be quite easy. Le fou, as an example, doit continuer à le faire contre son corps et contre la société. So society makes it very difficult. You are out of joint. You are not in step. You are alienated as a result of the world within which you live. De là, ces mille tricheries, ces appels aux mythes et aux formes caricaturales de l'existence primitive, elles ont un sens humain. La folie est une création non passivité. And that's the key right at the end. Madness is creation, not passivity. And we need to see in madness that kind of humanism, I suppose. Now, I mentioned that Tuskies actually finds a case kind of study of Nerval, who's a kind of 19th century romantic poet, and in order to try and explain how this delirium of the end of the world materializes, and then what are the kind of practical implications. So here he's quoting Nerval. Nerval says, "One evening around midnight, I was walking up to the suburb where my home was located, when looking up by chance, I noticed the number of a house lit up by a street lamp. The number was the same as my age. Immediately looking down, I saw before me a woman with pale complexion and hollow eyes, who seemed to me to have Aurelia's features. I said to myself, this is an omen, either of her death or mine, but I don't know why. I stuck to the latter supposition, and I was struck by the idea that it must be the next day at the same time." And so Tuskies is using Nerval to exemplify this fertile moment, this trigger of the psychosis, and how it manifests itself in the way that Nerval thinks. It's you or me, one of us, her death or mine. The number, the street lamp was the house of the number of the house was the same as my age, and so on. These are kind of delusional thoughts. And think back to Lacan, we have to take it as a whole. That's the idea. So, and then Tuskies explains it to us. He says, chez Nerval, un autre accès de folie commence par une expérience de la fin du monde. Nerval voit les étoiles s'étendre, voit apparaître un soleil noir et un globe rouge. Mais si le délire de la fin du monde ne semble pas avoir été précédé par une période de doute et d'inquiétude angoissante, la signification terrible de l'événement ne jette pas non plus Nerval dans le désespoir. So, for Tuskies, the idea is that ultimately madness is a kind of salvation. That's why Tuskies is so radical. That's why Tuskies is, I suppose, a kind of precursor for Fanon. Okay? We're all too accustomed, he says, to seeing the negative aspects of a madman's illness, when in fact this specifically and radically human aspect only reveals itself to him for the first time in his life, in his illness, at the very heart of his illness. So there's something productive happening here. This slow descent into a kind of delusion is actually remarkably productive. It is an attempt to restructure the world, virtually demand and you request the end of a world, psychically, but also in the world, you can see it in the world, and then you can begin reconstructing. Nerval, Tuskies says, is not deceiving us when he speaks of an increase in his lucidity, because the way that Nerval, and this is what Tuskies shows, didn't experience this delusion as a negative phenomenon, but instead saw joy and the capacities in it, the comprehensions that emerged from it. And then he quotes Nerval, Tuskies. He says, never, as far as myself is concerned, have I felt better. So there is this fundamentally humane aspect for Tuskies of understanding this end of the world, this process of, I suppose, the trigger of the psychosis and what it means and what it wants. Tuskies thinks we should take these things seriously and try to understand. We should try to understand what is in these delusional phenomena that give us, or give at least the patient, the person who is in that situation, the desire for this end of the world. So we come now then to trying to link all these bits together. Okay? Fanon and both across all his earth. But we know this if we've read, and I'm sure we'll have very closely read Fanon. Fanon spends a lot of time explaining that we try to go through rationality. Right? He says that scientists have said that there's no difference between black and white. There's no difference. Racism doesn't exist scientifically. You scientists, you proved it. And yet here we are, white people cling to their racism. Les scientifiques, après beaucoup de réticence, avaient admis, c'est eux qui ont admis, que le nègre était un humain, in vivo et arbitro, Le nègre s'était révélé analogue au blanc, même morphologie, même histologie. La raison s'assurait la victoire sur tous les plans. Je réintégrais les assemblées, mais je dus les chanter. J'avais rationalisé le monde, right? The idea is that Fanon tries to go to rationality. He does try. Le monde m'avait rejeté au nom du préjugé de couleur. Puisque sur le plan de la raison, l'accord n'était pas possible, je me rejetais vers l'irrationalité. Irrationality comes with a response to a refusal of recognizing on the rational sphere. Aux charges du blanc d'être plus irrationnel que moi, j'étais, pour les besoins de la cause, adopté le processus régressif, mais il restait que c'était une arme étrangère. Ici, je suis chez moi, je suis bâti d'irrationnel, je patauge dans l'irrationnel jusqu'au cou. So, in a sense, it's important for Fanon to be in this irrational swamp, to use it, to utilize it as a tool, to request the end of this world, to break down this structure. And it's again because the process of colonization, the process of racism creates this psychotic situation. This alienated process for Fanon happens as a result of the social world. Je sentis naître en moi, he says in Slogan, des lames de couteau. Je pris la décision de me défendre. En bon tacticien, je voulus rationaliser le monde, montrer aux Blancs qu'il était dans l'erreur. Magie noire, he says, mentalité primitive, animisme, érotisme animal, tout cela reflue vers moi. Tout cela caractérise les peuples n'ayant pas suivi l'évolution de l'humanité. Parvenu à ce point, j'hésitais longtemps avant de m'engager. Les étoiles se firent agressives. And here we think of Gérard de Nerval, where the black sun went out and the stars went out. Les étoiles se firent agressives. Il me fallait choisir. Que dis-je? Je n'avais pas le choix. La mise en question du monde colonial par le colonisé n'est pas une confrontation rationnelle des points de vue. Elle n'est pas un discours sur l'universel, mais l'affirmation enchevelée d'une originalité posée comme absolue. Le monde colonial est un monde man-based. And so again, Fanon builds, whether it's in Colonial Masque Blanc, talking about the rationality, talking about all these different aspects that kind of seem to suggest a kind of latent psychotic desire for the end of the world, right? La fin du monde par l'autre. This continues throughout his work. And in The Wretched of Europe, he says, in Les Derniers de la Terre, he says, toutefois, dans la lutte de libération, ce peuple autrefois réparti en cercles irréels, ce peuple en proie à un étroit, indicible, mais heureux, de se perdre dans une tourmente onirique. Okay, so this kind of delirious, dreamlike fantasy state se disloque, se réorganise et enfante dans le sang et dans les larmes des confrontations très réelles et très immédiates. And then it goes on, it says le colonialisme n'est pas une machine à penser, n'est pas encore doué de raison, which is why we need to overcome with an even greater irrationalism, right? Une plus grande violence. So this argument runs counter to Françoise Vergès, who wants to see madness is one of the obstacles of freedom for Fanon. Whereas I don't see it like that at all. I see it as it goes through madness. You have to go through irrationality in order to place yourself and your beliefs and your dignity in the face of someone who totally refuses it for you. And this argument is actually something that is discussed elsewhere. So there's a colleague in France, Guillaume Sibertin-Blanc, who also kind of makes this argument about the importance of madness for the development of this kind of courage, this kind of trigger for the end of the world, kind of trigger for decolonization. And so Guillaume Sibertin-Blanc puts it like this, he says, quelles conséquences on déduire quant à la référence fanonienne au vécu de la fin du monde? Sinon que s'y révélerait non simplement en pâtir le fait de subir l'extrême violence de la guerre coloniale et ses effets psychiques, mais au contraire une puissance liminaire, métapolitique, à savoir la capacité de symptômes comme production ou création, la capacité créatrice de la folie elle-même, précisément au sens où la folie est une création, non une passivité. And so it's this idea, ultimately, that means that for Fanon, we need violence. Like, violence is part and parcel of what he's looking for. He's for the end of the world, total désordre absolu, right? L'événement déclenchant, he says, est principalement l'atmosphère sanglante, this idea of l'atmosphère de fin du monde, impitoyable, la généralisation de pratiques inhumaines, l'impression tenace pour les gens d'assister à une véritable apocalypse. I think I'm running out of time, Laura. How am I doing? Do you know?
Yeah. Fine.
Okay, perfect. So obviously this is not, it's not just crazy. It's not just there's a kind of black psychosis and what we need to do is we just need to channel it and then it's violence into violence and madness is the answer and madness is the solution. I'm not talking about decolonization. I'm talking about the trigger, the moments that lead up the awareness, the kind of elementary phenomena, the moments where you realize things can no longer go on as they went on yesterday. There's a fundamental shift in the way that you perceive the world, and there is no going back. That's the moment that Cruz wants to talk about, that Fanon is trying to channel, of this desire for the end of the world. But that doesn't mean that you stay in this psychotic moment, okay? And for Fanon is very clear that it is just a trigger, it is the moment that gets you there, where you realize that there is no way out. And then you need to then think of strategy, and you need to think of ways of decolonizing that are different. But the moment of getting there is a kind of psychotic moment, because you need to break out of anything that you have been told before. The social world, as it's currently figured, is wrong. You're not crazy. The world is actually crazy. Le racisme antiraciste, Fanon 16, la volonté de défendre sa peau qui caractérise la réponse colonisée à l'oppression coloniale, représente évidemment des raisons suffisantes pour s'engager dans la lutte. Mais on ne soutient pas une guerre, on ne subit pas une répression énorme, on n'assiste pas à la disparition de toute sa famille pour faire triompher la haine et le racisme. Le racisme, la haine, le ressentiment, le désir légitime de vengeance ne peuvent alimenter une guerre de libération. Ces éclairs dans la conscience qui jettent le cœur dans des chemins tumultueux, qui lancent dans un onirisme, here it is again, the trance, un onirisme quasi pathologique, où la face de l'autre m'invite au vertige, où mon sang appelle le sang de l'autre, où ma mort, par simple inertie, appelle la mort de l'autre. Cette grande passion des premières heures. Again, this is just the trigger, this is just the beginning. Se disloque si elle avait entendu se nourrir sa propre substance. Il est vrai que les interminables extractions des forces colonialistes réintroduisent les éléments émotionnels dans la lutte, donnent aux militants de nouveaux motifs de haine, de nouvelles raisons de partir à la recherche du colon à abattre. The treatment of the colonizer sometimes brings you back to this psychotic frame because of the sheer barbarity, right? But it is a reactive force. It's not something that comes naturally. And so ultimately, this is, I think, what Fanon means when he talks of la folie créatrice, right? And this is a fundamental mistranslation in Wretched of the Earth, because in Wretched of the Earth, it's not so said folie, it's something else that I don't remember. But he specifically says that it's only through madness that you can emerge from these situations. Il faut réfléchir à la question de la violence. Les hommes colonisés, ces esclaves des temps modernes, sont impatients. Ils savent que seule cette folie peuvent les soustraire à l'oppression coloniale. And so it's this idea, only this madness, which comes from Lacan, goes through the CS, ends up in Fanon's hands, where it is radicalized and revolutionized to mean the desire, the trigger, the wanting of the end of this colonial environment. Okay, so I have published this research. It is published in the Journal for Humanistic Psychology, and there's a QR code if you want to have access to it. But otherwise, thank you for your time and your attention.
Good evening, everybody, and it's a real pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. I'm really pleased, and just before I give a brief introduction, let me say that I have a much longer version, but Muriam said, and I think she might be right, that maybe a short intro at this stage might be the best thing, given that everybody is kind of keen to think about other matters beyond 6 o'clock, half 6. But I will say that I am hugely pleased to introduce Muriam Davis, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I first met Muriam at a conference in Oran, Algeria in 2012. The conference was organized to commemorate Algeria's 50 years of independence. It was titled 1962, a World. She gave a brilliant paper that really put the cat amongst the pigeons. And there was a very vibrant response, I would even say hostile, and that was brilliant. That was absolutely wonderful.
Is this what you decided to keep?
Yes, this is what I decided to keep, because it gets some element of the essence here. I have followed her career since then with great interest and expectation, neither of which have been disappointed. Her most recent monograph, and I will put, her most recent monograph, Markets of Civilization, Islam and Racial Capitalism in Algeria, published by Duke University Press in 2022, makes, I think, a field-defining contribution to post-colonial and economic history of Algeria, and offers new approach to how we might think about economy and cultural studies. In this book, she traces how French colonial officials in Algeria constructed what she calls a racial regime of religion, a body of thought and institutional practice that racialized Algerian Islam in relation to economic planning and social reform. She writes in a way that is imbued by a sophisticated approach to theory, and she articulates that in a style which is compelling and absolutely balanced. I'm a fan. She's an incredibly cool historian, and I'll not go through the page and a half that I have left here. Muriam, over to you.
Thank you, Pat, for that overly generous introduction. I only have negative memories of that conference. I believe somebody called my paper une salade de fruits. Yeah, we could perhaps talk about that later. I'm going to try to pull up my slides. As I do that, thank you all for still being here. It's late in the conference. And the other thing I'm slideshow. I'm also really grateful to the organizers for having me and for all the work they've put into this conference. It's my first time here. I've made a lot of new friends. I've seen some very old friends, and so I'm just really grateful to the labor that goes into these kinds of things, from arrangements, and also to the invitation to be here is also been an honor. Speaking after disenclosure is a lot of pressure, but I'll see what I can do. I should also say right off the bat that the centennial of Fanon's birth has made me into a Fanon studies scholar, which I am not. So I'll start with the caveat that I am a historian of Algeria. I do a lot of work in intellectual history, but I am not, strictly speaking, a scholar of Fanon. And what I'm working on at the moment is a book project, inshallah will come out with Verso, that tries to put debates on Fanon after 1962 in the context of Algerian intellectual history. So I'm trying to tell the story of what Algerians had to say and how they critiqued Fanon. That doesn't mean I always agree with the critiques, but I do think there's something there to recover about how Algerians made sense of their own revolution through the figure of Fanon, which I think is very much in spirit of the conflicts. I will say that, like for many people who care about the region, nothing has been the same since the 7th of October, including my engagement with theory and with Fanon. And so as I'm giving this paper, and it might sound like a diatribe against decolonial studies, I promise you that is not my intention. I try to be a generous person with other people on the left. Something that has preoccupied me is what are the tools we need as organizers in the face of genocide in Palestine, in Sudan, and with authoritarianism at home. And so part of my critique here is also thinking through the theoretical tools that will allow us to be better organizers and to think about what is efficient politically in this moment. So I have no qualms about the kind of utilitarian approach I have to theory at this moment. I'd like to start with an archival finding that set me down this path, this project. I was working at the IMEC a few years ago, and I stumbled on a letter from a Mastero, not shown here. The IMEC, as many of you know, is notoriously difficult to get images from. But I found this letter from Frantz Fanon, dated September 1963. Mastero was in the process of compiling a list of Fanon's articles for a republication volume that he was hoping to put together. And he wrote to Renaud Camus, the Algerian nationalist, future prime minister, who had been Fanon's comrade and mujahid. So Mastero, a perfectly polite email, asks Malik which articles from Al-Mujahid were penned by Fanon. Totally reasonable request, of putting together an edited volume. But Renaud Malik is clearly annoyed in his response. And he writes back to Mastero, and he says that this question overlooked the profoundly collaborative vocation of the journal. He told Mastero that The Wretched of the Earth was a continuation of the themes that the editorial collective of Al-Mujahid had debated time and time again in their offices. And he also said that this comment was not meant to reduce Fanon's personal contribution in any way. He wasn't trying to cut down Fanon's brilliance or his solidarity. Instead, he wanted to emphasize that Fanon was situated in a concrete context, and he was marvelously integrated in that milieu. And so this is very much an anecdote that has become an origin story for my project. I guess all origin stories are fabricated, but this is something I did find in the archive, nevertheless. So I'd like to reflect on the political and social universe in which Fanon debated with, learned from, and also imparted lessons on his Algerian comrades. And I think this is something that Fanon would have appreciated, given his prescient words, "Come then, comrades, the European game has finally ended. We must find something different," right? This could not resonate any more than it does in the present time. I don't mean this to say that Fanon would have agreed that the task of decentering Europe should lead to a kind of essentialism or nativism, however. I do believe he was a committed internationalist. And so what does it mean to decenter Europe while remaining true to the spirit of internationalism? And in so doing today, I have kind of two Fanons that I'm going to compare. One is the Fanon of decolonization. So this is the historical period during the Cold War, what Frederick Cooper calls, in the most literal sense, the ending of colonial rule over territories that were once part of the European Empire. In intellectual and history circles, this takes on the kind of bad connotation of a contextualist argument, and so perhaps I'm a bit guilty of going back to a kind of contextualism here. But I do think that in these years, and however brief they were, Fanon was trying to answer a series of strategic questions about the Algerian Revolution, the role of armed struggle, the revolutionary capacity of the peasantry, and the possibility of internationalism given the state of the French left. At the same time, I am also interested in how the reception of Fanon has evolved, especially in the last 10 years. I teach in California, where the decolonial turn has become really hegemonic. And often when I read about the decolonial Fanon, and here I'm very grateful to the keynote yesterday, that was kind of a masterclass in thinking about some of the problems here. But as I read the decolonial Fanon and the decolonial Algeria, I have trouble recognizing my own country of study at times. And so I'm interested in what does it mean to apply decolonial theory, not just to Algeria, but to the Middle East and North Africa? Is this a body of thought that, of course, comes from Latin America, that 1492 is a moment of rupture? What do we do with that as, well, what do I do with that as a scholar of Algeria, but what do we do with that as people who are interested in Eastern Europe? And so my talk is going to move back and forth between these two historical moments, the Fanon of decolonization, thinking concretely about revolution, and this decolonial Fanon that has emerged in recent years. And I will also, perhaps unfairly, pick on Mignolo, because I do think he represents this in the clearest fashion. And I should also say with some humility, I understand the decolonial canon is broader than that, but for the purposes of today, and for what my students tend to read and cite the most, I think it's telling. Okay, so Mazinon Torres writes that unlike decolonization, decoloniality, quote, refers to the logic, metaphysics, ontology, and matrix of power created by the massive processes of colonization and decolonization. And so in this school of thought, they are clearly positioning themselves against the postcolonial, but also against the shortcomings of decolonization as a historical moment and what it bequeaths to us in the present. Interestingly, Fanon is one of the rare thinkers who is not decried as being overly Marxist or complicit with Western modernity. So poor Patrice Lumumba, for example, is critiqued for remaining in the confines of communism. But Fanon seems to occupy this privileged place for these thinkers. So again, my hope is that this talk is not just a critique of the decolonial Fanon, but also to ask two main questions, which used to be on the slide, but I think I forgot to say it. And I'm interested again in what our current political moment and how critical paradigms circulate geographically, right? So what kind of tools do we need right now, and what does the decolonial Fanon tell us about how critical theory circulates among the United States, France, and North Africa? So before reminding us of Fanon's inscription, perhaps conscription as a decolonial figure, which is a continuation of last night's discussion, I'm going to move on to talking about the damné, but this time to think about the figure of the peasant or the fallah. I'll then talk a little bit about the tensions between the Algerian Communist Party, mentioned earlier, and the FLN, and to think about Fanon's own position in these debates that were very polemical during and after the revolution, i.e. the role of the Communist Party in Algerian nationalism. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about language, both in Fanon's writings, back to the essay on the radio, but also what language meant in terms of nation building. And so my argument is that the questions of Arabization and the French language are more about how do you build a successful nation state, and less about ontological or epistemic purity in some cases. Okay, so I won't spend too much time on this in terms of what I mean by decolonial, but I think it's interesting to remark, and I spent a lot of time in North Africa talking about the decolonial in the past year or two, and talking about Fanon, that much like in France, when people use the term les études décoloniales or le camp décolonial, it's a much broader rubric, right? I think in some ways, the United States has colonized what this word means by inscribing it in Mignolo and company. And I in political discussions in France, always, je revendique ma position comme quelqu'un qui fait partie du camp décolonial. It's a different political formation. And so I want to start by saying that. And I do hope that, seen from North Africa, there's a way to rethink this with perhaps more local references. But in the North American Academy where I work, this is a rejection of post-colonial studies, and also a rejection, as we saw last night, of many figures such as Spivak, or Homi Bhabha, or Edward Said, or Derrida, and even Spivak's notion of a strategic essentialism in which colonized actors make a claim to authenticity for politically expedient goals is a very different project than the decolonial term's quest for authenticity and recovery. I'm going to go ahead a little bit here, since I think we covered much of this last night. Mignola wrote, Fanon's was not just a general or universal inscription of the subjectivity of the modern subject. He brought back into the house of knowledge the subjectivity of the damné, the denied and defamed subject that had been beyond the possibilities of knowing, unquote. And so what I think is interesting here is that above all, Fanon's writings and the notion of the damné are of course on this colonizer binary, but they also have to do with the bodies that have been disqualified by thinking. And so there's a real embrace of the corporeal, of the body that has knowledge, and of this inscription. And so there's kind of ontological positioning to that. I think this is a very different way of framing the damné than the discussions in the 1950s and 1960s. The damné becomes a dehumanized subject who experiences the violence of the colonial system as a physical habitus. And as was pointed out last night, the phrase le damné de la terre, of course, goes back to the International. And every time I'm struck by the fact that this discussion among, in Trotskyist circles about the Fourth International, Pablo Raptis, who actually goes and becomes an advisor to Ben Bella, who writes the March Decrees, right? That all evaporates in this particular rendering of Redemption. For Fanon, in many ways, the truest of all, this is absolutely not this, okay, here we go, the slide. The truest of all the damnés for Fanon was the peasant. And there's been an enormous amount written on the question of the peasantry in Fanon. This is an image I found in the archive. It's in my first book, where you see the Fellah l'Algérie in the middle, surrounded by the scorpions and the kind of vermin of Algerian nationalism. And I start with this to show the ways in which the Fellah became a trope. The Fellah became a subject of authenticity and a demonized subject in the minds of French colonial planners. So Fanon writes, it is obvious that in colonial countries, only the peasant is revolutionary. It has nothing to lose and everything to gain, their famous quote. The underprivileged and starving peasant is the exploited who very soon discovers that only violence pays. For him, there's no compromise, no possibility of concession. So this is clearly one way where Fanon is trying to stretch Marx and Marxism. And we all know the famous line in the colonies, the superstructure is a substructure, the cause is a consequence, et cetera, et cetera. You're rich because you're white because you're rich. So it's this question about class analysis and race in a settler colony. So on the one hand, I think in subsuming this internal contradiction, i.e. Algerian society and the ways in which it was not flattened into a singular fellah or a singular peasant subject, Fanon is trying to refute this kind of colonial tradition of developmentalism, which also offered a flattened peasant that things like the Constantine Plan or colonial development pretended to care about and pretended to offer a kind of social uplift for. At the same time, however, Fanon is not interested in a sociological or class-based analysis of the peasant. This is not the kind of granular discussion that we see in somebody like Bourdieu, who actually goes out and does field work. And maybe this is about the true lie, right? Again, this is not to be a critique, but kind of a thinking about how and why certain tropes get discussed in Algeria at this moment. There's a very robust discussion in France, in sociological circles, and in rural sociology about what is a peasant in Africa and in the Middle East, how does it differ from Europe. That is not the discussion going on here, as you all know. I think Fanon is more interested in thinking about the peasant as this symbol of nationalism. On the other hand, there's a decolonial reading of that decision, which is to take it as a sign of the fact that class analysis and Marxism is above all, and here I'm quoting Mignolo, a European invention responding to European problems. So the damnés in this line of thought are not defined in regards to their position in the global system of capital or the relationship to the land, but their ontological non-existence in the zone of non-being. And in many ways, I've been thinking a lot about Gavin Arnall's book, that argues that there's this tension between Nietzsche and Hegel in Fanon's writing. And I think some of this actually can kind of come back to that and which one wants to really lay their hat on. But the question is, I think, for me also, how to account for the split between a more Marxisant Fanon and his later posthumous inscription in decolonial discussions on ontology. And one answer, I think, is that the field has traveled quite a long distance from this Algerian context, in which Fanon was interested not only in theory, he was not the theorist of the Algerian Revolution with a capital T, he was interested in praxis. He was writing for the revolution, with the revolution. And so not all Algerians, even during the revolution, but certainly after it, embraced his analysis. And somehow this can seem really shocking to folks. But especially his communist and Trotskyist comrades, who knew Fanon, worked aside Fanon, and respected Fanon greatly, have really strong critiques of his writings. The Algerian anthropologist Mahfoud Bennoun highlighted the class stratification among Algerians, arguing that the division of Algerian society into a colonial bourgeoisie and a lumpen proletariat, and here I'm quoting Bennoun, contrary to Fanon's thesis, appears to hamper the development of class consciousness and put a brake on the militancy of the comparatively small and rising working class. Similarly, the Algerian sociologist Ali Kenz, who was writing under a pseudonym at the time, critiqued the government's populism under Ben Bella for obfuscating the reality of class struggle. And for Ali Kenz, this was a political strategy rather than a kind of revolutionary hope. And so this romantic vision of the peasantry that was deployed by the FLN during the revolution also served to kind of to foreclose discussions about class composition after independence. And I have a forthcoming piece that looks at communist critiques of Fanon. It was very hard to get through readers' reports, actually. Like, people were quite taken aback that these critiques existed. And again, I'm not trying to say I agree with them or not, but I do think the fact that they happened matters for us to think about the Algerian debates after independence, because Fanon, once again, was not alone, and this also shocks people that there were Algerians also thinking alongside of Fanon sometimes. So I think we're remiss to read Fanon's writings as a definitive history of Algerian nationalism, which unfortunately, when people teach the Algerian Revolution, I was talking about this at lunch today, you give them some Fanon, you give them the Bataille d'Alger, and then you think, oh wow, they've understood very little about this chapter in history, unfortunately, despite the brilliance of those two pieces. He's participating in the FLN struggle to present itself as a radically new nationalist force that had a monopoly on anti-colonial mobilization. That's what nationalists need to do to win an anti-colonial war. So in this sense, you have not only the tradition of the Algerian Communist Party, but also Islamic reformers, people like Mohammed al-Milli, who works with him at Al-Mujahid and go on to write about Fanon in Arabic, also with some critiques. But instead of placing the FLN in this longer genealogy of Algerian nationalism, Fanon critiqued nationalist groups prior to the emergence of the FLN for their reformist nature. He writes that the ambiguity of their political position, and here I'm going to read this quote, this characteristic of nationalist political parties, i.e. their ambiguity on the question of violence, must be attributed to the nature of their leaders and their supporters. The supporters of the nationalist parties are urban voters. These workers, elementary school teachers, small tradesmen, and shopkeepers who have begun to profit from the colonial situation in a pitiful sort of way, of course, have their own interests in mind. These colonial subjects are militant activists under the abstract slogan, power to proletariat, forgetting that in their first part of the world, slogans of national liberation should come first. So this is, of course, a very direct critique of the Algerian and French Communist Party, which bears out, right, from the Popular Front's government's traitorous stance regarding colonization to when Maurice Thorez famously categorized Algeria as a nation in formation during a speech in 1939, There are multiple examples of the hypocrisy of the mainstream communist left leading up to the Algerian Revolution. Proximity to the PCF in many ways had become an Achilles heel for the Algerian Communist Party, which had been historically dominated by Europeans. And these Europeans were not immune from some of the paternalizing and racist attitudes towards their Algerian comrades. Nevertheless, these scabs had worked to Algerianize and to Arabize the party after the Second World War. The Algerian Communist Party had not directly contributed to the November 1st uprisings, but their members were actually quite divided on the question of violence, meaning that many members of the PCA actually did join the FLN during the war, even as the PCA refused to dissolve itself into the FLN. So in other words, while a number of the members fought and died in the Maquis, the Communist Party always insisted that it should have its own political existence. All of this is not lost on Fanon. As we saw in Zahza's film, the communist Georges Couillon was an old friend of Fanon's from Lyon and worked for Fanon in Buda. This was a European communist who was killed in the Maquis, not by the French, but by comrades who refused his insistence that the Algerian Communist Party should have an autonomous existence. In her excellent study, Alison Drew recounts that the role of the PCA was, quote, to provide a proletarian perspective, whereas the armed struggle, in the Central Committee's view, was primarily a peasant-based struggle. There's a number of examples of this conundrum that Fanon faced in terms of strategy versus what is actually happening on the ground. When his comrade, Aben Ramdan, was killed also by Algerian comrades, Fanon kind of doesn't know what to do at this moment. And according to a friend and comrade of Fanon's, Pierre Chollet, this was the only time where Fanon felt that the Al-Mujahid editorial team did not have independence because it refused to acknowledge that this had been done at the hands of comrades and not by the hands of the French. So I think when reading Fanon, and when he claims that the PCA denounces the FLN as terroriste provocateur, or when he depicts the partisans of Salih Hajj in certain ways, we should not read this as an accurate analysis of Algerian nationalism, but rather as the words of somebody who is involved in the FLN struggle and is having to make really difficult decisions about strategy. Right? I don't envy Fanon's position, given his bravery, having to think about what to do when a good friend has been killed by comrades. Nevertheless, I also think the decolonials' insistence that ergo communism in Algeria was not a nationalist force shouldn't be induced from Fanon's comments. So again, if Fanon aligns the relationship between the Fallah and the working classes, or the historical role of Algerian communism, this is not because he occupied the worldview of coloniality. This was because he was at a certain distance from the sociological realities of Algerian life in terms of the Fallah, but also he was writing as a spokesperson for the FLN. I'm going to move on to my second point here, which is about language. So Fanon is forced to wade through these moral and political questions, and he's also trying to wrestle with what the Algerian nation will look like on the other side. And here's another tension between the Fanon of decolonization and the decolonial Fanon. In many ways, I think Fanon's writings on national culture are at odds with the decolonial insistence on the coherence or essential alterity of non-Western paradigms, right? And for those of us who work on the Middle East, there's an enormous scholarship on the Nakhda that shows how tradition and modernity are being wrestled with in similar terms from the 1850s onwards, right? So the intellectual history of the region also does not really bear this out. Interestingly, and this is a point I had forgotten until going back to read this piece recently, Fanon makes a parallel between negritude and Pan-Arabism in the essay on national culture. He also considers Pan-Arabism to be synonymous with Islam, but I'll leave that to the side for the moment. He sees both of these as formations that are a response to the essentializing gaze of the colonial system that had seen an inferior African or Arab culture. So he writes, the issue at stake is not yet to secure a national culture, not yet to plunge into the groundswell of nations, but rather to pit an Arab or African culture against the universal condemnation of the colonizer. That's the first quote. And he worries that these regional cultural formations will fail to articulate a specifically national formation. And he insists that anti-colonial struggle has to be the key in rescuing this backwards-looking set of traditional behaviors. He writes, the nation is not only a precondition of culture, its perpetual renewal, it is a necessity. And so this is also consistent with his essays on the radio in L'enceinte de la Révolution Algérienne, where he notes that before the outbreak of the revolution, speaking Arabic, refusing French as a language and as a means of cultural oppression was a distinct and daily form of differentiation for the national experience. However, after the anti-colonial war was underway, in large part aided by the radio, he notes that, quote, and this is the other quote up here, the reality of combat and the confusion of the occupier stripped the Arabic language of its sacred character and the French language of its negative connotations. The new language of the nation could then make itself known through multiple meaningful channels, unquote. I think Fanon was undoubtedly too optimistic on this score in terms of the history of Arabization. Algerian intellectuals like Malik Haddad would stop writing entirely and say that for him, French could only be a language of exile. But nevertheless, I think this quote shows that Fanon is not wedded to language as epistemology, right? Fanon is open to the fact that languages shift and that they can mean different things politically. And so I think he would have agreed with French as a temps de guerre, to go back to Kate Marsh from this morning. But there's no singular logic of coloniality or decoloniality on the side of French and Arabic as a linguistic choice. So this zero-sum game, I think, is quite far from Fanon's inscription in Decolonization. And I just wanted to kind of wrap up before I offer a kind of larger set of questions about the question of nation building and language in Algeria, which is a long and complicated story, but just to give you one idea of how questions of strategy, I think, were at the forefront rather than questions of ideological purity. Oh, okay. So the Algerian intellectual nationalist and Minister of National Education under Boumediene, Moustapha Lacharaf, wrote extensively about Arabization in the 1960s and 1970s. And he grappled with the profound ways that the French conquest had transformed Algerian society. He found it naive to think that Arabic could simply be reintroduced as a primary language after 132 years of colonial rule, especially given the extremely high illiteracy rates in Algeria. And we know the history of cooperation in terms of bringing in professors not from Algeria, but other Arabic-speaking countries for Arabization. So Lacharaf argued that the French regime had made Arabic the realm of the sacred and noted that the true mother tongue for Algerians was Darija, like Algerian Arabic rather than Fusha, modern standard Arabic. The question of language was also linked to class and the aspirations of the petite bourgeoisie who were empowered through independence. So for Lacharaf, neither Arabic nor Islam could offer a return to a pure outside. Neither of these gave you access to authenticity or something outside colonial modernity, even if he knew that both would need to be appropriated and integrated into national culture. Lacharaf's tenure at the Ministry of Education was very fraught. He oversaw a pause in Arabization, which provoked the anger of a lot of his colleagues, including Ahmed Talib Ibrahim. But what fascinates me about this discussion, that is often seen as francophone versus arabophone, is that their disagreement is not over the desirability of Arabic. Neither of them is arguing that the French language is not a colonial thing. Neither of them sees the French language as desirable. Neither of them is denying the deep epistemic violence that came with assimilation. But what they're interested in is the politics that would allow Arabization to succeed in the future. So Lacharaf's discussion of Arabization is linked to the history of class formation, the history of education, and indeed, as the Algerian sociology Aïssa Qadri notes, Lacharap himself should be understood as part of this milieu in which bilingual intellectuals tended to enjoy a dominant class position. And this explains why some university instructors, even in the late 1960s, started to ask for Darija as a language of instruction at the university. Okay, so I'm gonna finish up here. Interesting. These slides are interesting. I must have done this in a moment of jet-lagged blur because I don't recognize my own slides. I did not go home and drink all the wine, I promise, but I'm not recognizing my own slides. Okay, so undoubtedly, and here I actually do believe this, despite what I've just said, I think the decolonial turn offers a very strong critique of Eurocentricism and also brings us back to the need for multiple epistemologies, planned to my lunch date this afternoon. But this was also a concern I think we found in postcolonialism, right? This might be a new language for it, a new way of framing it, a new historical context to learn from, but the dis-ease with European epistemologies is something that people have been talking about in multiple languages for quite a long time. As an intellectual historian, the prospect of a return to an authentic self or the past seems foreclosed by the multiple ways that colonial knowledge embedded itself in local societies and patterns of thought. So this search for the external is something that leaves me quite puzzled. I teach Rifat Tahrawi's trip to France often in my undergraduate classes, and my students are shocked that it is his trip to Europe and to France that brings the discipline of Egyptology to Egypt in some ways, right? So how outside does one need to be? How liberal is one allowed to be? At what point does somebody's Marxism get in the way of their authenticity? And there's a rich tradition, of course, of multiple Marxisms in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Don't need to tell all of you that. So in 2025, our world looks very different than that of Fanon. And again, I'm thinking about the political uses of theory in this moment. So Walter Mignolo at some point characterizes the Sharjah art festivals as the new Bandar. And this leads to, that's funny, it's objectively funny, but it leads to a question of where is the global South, right? Is the global South a moral category? Is it a geographical category? If we're thinking about Morocco and the UAE at this moment, settler colonialism and genocide is also part of their activities, right? There's not a pure actor based on geography. This is being recorded. Probably not going to Morocco anytime soon. Okay. Along with Fanon, the other Algerian intellectual who does count as decolonial, as I went back and was kind of rereading, okay, so I work in Algeria, where are my decolonial figures? And the other one, fascinatingly, for Mignolo, is Malik Ben Nabi, who a number of us have been chatting about. Ben Nabi has an incredibly harsh critique of Fanon, basically saying the only way you can believe that the revolution starts from zero is if you are profoundly out of touch with the Islamic and Arabic roots of Algerian culture. I am not saying I agree with Ben Nabi on this, but how do you put these two figures in the same decolonial canon is something that I find interesting. So Fanon and Ben Nabi are both dwelling in exteriority for Mignolo. I'm not exactly sure which exteriorities, how that Venn diagram looks. I find Ben Nabi a fascinating thinker. I end my first book with him during the Hirak, but as I was saying earlier to a friend here, I end my book with Ben Nabi in the Hirak, and some Algerian colleagues found this objectionable. They found Ben Nabi as a kind of marked figure politically that doesn't sit well with certain kind of secular leftist figures. Treating Islamic discourses as somehow outside of Western modernity also requires a kind of historical amnesia and ends up re-essentializing a fundamental civilizational difference between the East and West, something that we think of with Samuel Huntington perhaps, but perhaps not something those of us committed to social justice and liberation, or at least I don't particularly want to get behind. And so that the political uses of theory are the same, let me back up. At the same time, the political uses of theory are not the same in different places. And this gets me back to my question about what Edward Said calls traveling theory, or what tools are critical in what places and at what time. And that is not a constant story. this disjuncture between theory and its political uses is wonderfully explored by a friend and colleague, Fadi Bardawil, who looks at Lebanese revolutionaries in Lebanon in the 1960s and 1980s in relationship to the question of Palestine. Bardawil notes a disjuncture between intellectuals in the Middle East, based in the Middle East, who were, in his words, attached to an emancipatory politics under attack, on the one hand, and he compares them and contrasts them with diasporic oppositional thinkers in the metropole who inverted these terms. Those are also his words. And so what he's getting at there is his own uneasiness in the sense that people who critique Marxism for being fundamentally Orientalist, who often are based in the West in his story, tend to be, without wanting to, and this is not a question of kind of political bad faith, but they end up being complicit with kind of nativist authoritarian strands back home, right? And so Fadi is trying to explore what does it mean to be a critical intellectual in the diaspora versus in your home society. And I think that is a really open question, and as we follow polemics on people like Kamal Daoud, this is a question about what does it mean to have a critique of your home society at home, in what terms is that critique understandable, versus what does it mean when you make that critique somewhere else. And I don't need to go over this here, but there have been a number of people who have written about the uneasy complicity between decoloniality and ideologies like that of the BJP in India, right? Or high side using the great replacement theory. Again, we don't need to say that the global south has to be a place always of correct moral actors. So my hope is that there can be a more specifically North African decoloniality that emerges from this. I think we do need a way to account for the trajectory of decolonization on concrete terms. I don't think Algeria is a failed state. I don't think its independence was confiscated or failed, and I'm certainly not implying that. But I do think that there are ways to understand the need to push the frontiers of decolonization further, as people in the Iraq were using istiqlal as a rallying cry, right? That there's some unfinished work to be done there. And so I'm going to finish by saying that I read this desire for a pristine outside of Western modernity as a kind of cruel optimism, to use Lauren Berlant's phrase, right? That we have an attachment to the global south as a place of authenticity. We want a promise of ontological resistance to modernity, and this sustains a kind of anti-colonial politics. But I don't think this historical and political simplification is what we need if we're trying to promote a form of epistemological and institutional politics that can deal with the present moment. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.